Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the five twisted families of Appalachia and the dark secret they kept for 60 years that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from that helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. Blood never washes clean from limestone caves. In the brutalness unforgiving winter of 1907, as the wind howled a mournful dirge through the skeletal branches of West Virginia's mountains, state investigators, guided by whispers and disappearances that had finally grown too loud to ignore, unearthed a truth that the very soil seemed desperate to conceal. 17 sets of human remains, scattered and gnawed by time, were discovered across the chilling expanse of Whispering Hollow, a place where the thick, damp fog clings to the trees like secrets, and the iron-rich earth leaves a metallic taste in the air. The discovery was not merely a grave, for a grave implies a certain reverence, a final piece. This was a dumping ground, a library of the dead, each bone a silent, brittle testament to an unspeakable history. While a single death might suggest tragedy, a moment of violence or despair, 17, methodically disposed of over an unknown span of time, suggested something else entirely. It suggested a process, a chillingly efficient system. This question hung heavy in the frigid air, a palpable, freezing counterpoint to the hollow's strange and unnatural quiet. The investigators, hardened men accustomed to the grim realities of their profession, found themselves unnerved by the sheer scale and longevity of the crime. The initial report from Dr. Edmund Farweather, the state medical examiner who arrived on the scene wrapped in a heavy coat that seemed insufficient against the profound cold of the place, was a document of clinical precision. His reputation preceded him. He was a man of science and logic, one who believed that every mystery could be unraveled by careful observation. His notes were filled with anatomical details and forensic hypotheses. Yet, it was a single sentence found underlined in his private journal, which was rediscovered in the Kentucky State Archives in 1994, that truly captured the horror that had seeped into his professional soul. With the heavy stroke of a man burdened by an appalling revelation, a truth that defied rational explanation, he wrote, "The systematic nature of these remains suggests prolonged, organized activity spanning multiple generations." Generations. The word itself was a chasm, an abyss of time that transformed a gruesome crime scene into a monstrous legacy. It implied a tradition of death, a heritage of horror passed from parent to child. It begged a question that echoed far beyond the desolate ridges of the mountains. A question that probes the very heart of human darkness. What transforms ordinary families, seeking refuge from a world they distrust, into something unrecognizable? A monstrous, self-perpetuating entity lurking in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to believe. To understand the roots of this darkness, one must first understand the land that nurtured it, the cradle that rocked this evil. Whispering Hollow earned its name not from gentleness, but from a peculiar acoustic anomaly that made the landscape itself feel sentient. Sound carried strangely through its twisted geography, where five separate valleys converged like the gnarled fingers of a skeletal hand closing upon a secret. A snapping twig could sound like a gunshot, and a whisper could travel on the wind, distorted and sinister. It was a place designed by nature for isolation, a fortress of steep ridges and dense, ancient forests that discouraged the casual traveler and swallowed the unwary whole. The air here was different, heavy and thick, scented with damp earth, perpetual wood smoke, and something else, something vaguely sweet and organic that clung to the back of the throat. The ancient oaks were scarred by more than just weather, their bark holding stories that no human tongue dared to tell. Even the wildlife seemed to sense the wrongness of the place, moving with a skittish quiet not seen in other parts of the range. By 1850, this remote and forbidding landscape had been claimed by 5 families, each seeking what the burgeoning, increasingly crowded American nation could no longer offer: absolute isolation. A complete severance from the outside world. The Renfields, the Whitfords, the Harroways, the Treadwells, and the Blackmores. They were misfits, zealots, and fugitives from forgotten pasts, drawn together by a shared desire to escape the past and build a future on their own terms, far from the prying eyes of law, government, and society. They came seeking sovereignty over their own small world, a kingdom of rock and shadow. What they found, nestled in the deep darkness of the hollow, was a different kind of sovereignty, a license for their own worst impulses to flourish. The evil was not in the land itself, but in the desperate, hardened hearts they had brought with them. According to records compiled decades later by legal scholars studying the case, the origin of the arrangement, the monstrous system Dr. Farweather had identified, was not born of inherent, calculating evil, but of something far more: common desperation. An entry in a forgotten parish ledger from 1843, written in the fading ink of a traveling minister, notes the tragedy of the Harroway family, who lost their youngest child, a daughter named Elspeth, to winter fever during a season of brutal famine. It was Celestine Harroway, the mother, driven half mad by grief and starvation, who began to speak of dreams. In these dreams, she claimed, her starving child's ghost would appear at the foot of her bed, not as a comforting spirit, but as an accuser. The child's voice, she said, would ask with chilling clarity why they allowed strangers, well-fed travelers and fur trappers passing through to eat their fill while their own family wasted away. The question, born of a mother's profound grief, planted a seed of horrific logic. It was a dark and terrible calculus, but in the stark isolation of Whispering Hollow, it was a logic that took root and grew. Perhaps the dreams spoke a forbidden truth. Perhaps survival was not a right, but something to be taken from those who had a surplus. This contagion of thought spread from Celestine to her husband, and then, in quiet, desperate councils held in the dead of winter, to the other families. This logic of desperation, once seeded, grew into a monstrous tree whose branches ensnared the entire hollow. Within a generation, the arrangement was no longer a question of survival. It had evolved. By the turn of the century, the 5 families were not just neighbors. They were cogs in a single terrifyingly efficient machine, their lives and identities wholly subservient to its needs. Each family had cultivated a specific role, a specialization passed down from parent to child, all serving the Hollow's insatiable, institutionalized hunger. The Renfield cabin sat highest on the ridge, a veritable eagle's nest of weathered timber and watchful windows. From this perch, Isadora Renfield, a woman whose eyes held an unnerving stillness and who possessed a chilling gift for reading the intentions and vulnerabilities of strangers, maintained what locals euphemistically called the family collection. It was a room filled with trophies, a silver locket, a worn leather-bound book, a child's doll, a compass each a silent monument to a life extinguished. She was the lookout, the selector, the one who decided who was fit to enter the hollow and who would never leave. Further down the valley, Barnabas Whitford, a man with a disarmingly gentle voice and a cruel smile, controlled the valley's only reliable source of fresh water. This was a natural choke point for any trail passing through the region, a strategic asset he wielded with absolute authority. His hospitality was legendary, but it was a calculated, predatory performance. Every traveler, weary and thirsty, eventually knocked on his door, drawn into his web. His guest register, a large book bound in fine leather, was his most prized possession. In it, he meticulously documented every person who accepted his invitation to stay, his elegant script a chilling counterpoint to the grim fate that awaited them. Meanwhile, in the heart of the hollow, Celestine Herouet, the same woman whose grief had started it all, ran what passed for the area's general store. The store was a facade of normalcy in a place devoid of it. No inventory records from her 15 years of operation have ever been found. For her, business was not in selling goods, but in liquidating the assets of the dead. Personal effects, clothing, jewelry, tools, and even gold fillings were carefully processed and traded with merchants in distant towns who learned not to ask questions. Celestine was the master of turning human tragedy into quiet, untraceable profit. The first whispers of the truth came not from within the hollow, but from the outside world, in the form of bureaucratic anomalies and dismissed tales that painted a disturbing pattern. State records from 1906 show a statistical impossibility: 43 missing persons reports filed across 3 separate counties, all inexplicably tracing back to the same geographic center, Whispering Hollow. Travelers who managed to leave the valley, often fleeing in the dead of night, spoke of strange invitations that felt more like commands, of an unnerving, watchful silence, and of meals that tasted familiar yet fundamentally wrong. Officials, comfortable in their distant towns, dismissed these stories as mountain superstition, the fanciful ramblings of uneducated or drunken folk. Yet, the numbers didn't lie. 43 souls had walked into that fog and had been erased from the world. Within this sealed community, there was one man who understood the full scope of the horror because he was its living memory. Erasmus Fenwick, bound by blood and marriage to the other families, was the chronicler. He kept the ledgers, the meticulous, damning records of who came, what they possessed, and when they departed. His handwriting, clear and steady, documented decades of systematic predation with a terrifying, clinical detachment that belied the turmoil within him. He was not a monster in the same vein as the others. He was the machine's conscience, or what was left of it. His ledgers, which would one day be known as the Hollow's most damning evidence, were at the time his private torment. The act of writing was his ritual. The smell of the iron gall ink and the scratch of the nib on the page, a constant reminder of his complicity. He was a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making, forced to witness every cog and gear of the family's evil. He was the historian of a silent, 60-year war waged against the outside world, a war whose casualties were only now, in the winter of 1907, beginning to surface. The fragile, dull, 60-year silence of Whispering Hollow was not broken by the slow grind of official investigation, but by the frantic, desperate sound of a child's fist hammering against the solid oak door of the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. On the bitter night of January 14th, 1907, the door swung open to reveal a figure so small and frost-caked it seemed less a human boy and more a winter spirit. An apparition born of snow and abject terror. He was 13-year-old Samuel Fenwick, the grandson of Erasmus, and he had just walked 40 miles through a landscape that had consumed countless others. The smell of wet wool, pine needles, and raw animal fear filled the small, lamplit office as the boy collapsed. His chattering teeth the only sound he could make against the sudden, shocking warmth of the room. Sheriff Thomas Aldrich, a man whose career had been built on a foundation of rural pragmatism and patience, initially viewed the boy's arrival with a weary skepticism. He had seen too many family feuds and moonshine-fueled fantasies escalate into wild tales by the time they reached his desk. Mountain children, he knew, often possessed vivid imaginations, their minds fertile ground for elaborate stories woven from loneliness and folklore, especially after experiencing loss or displacement. The initial, disjointed fragments of Samuel's tale of secret meetings, of travelers who never left, of a dark family duty, seemed to confirm the sheriff's suspicions. He saw it as a textbook case of trauma-induced fantasy, the tragic but familiar byproduct of a harsh life in an unforgiving land. He offered the boy a blanket and a warm drink, his manner professional but detached, fully intending to send him to the local parish for care in the morning. But as Samuel's strength returned, so did the clarity of his words. And with that clarity came details. Details so specific, so mundane, and so horrifyingly precise that they began to chip away at the sheriff's professional composure like a pickaxe against stone. The boy spoke not of shadowy monsters, but of cold, hard logistics. He described a traveler who had vanished 2 years prior, a man whose disappearance had been officially recorded as a hunting accident. Samuel, however, described the man's silver watch fob, engraved with the initials JDM, an item he had seen just weeks ago glinting in the firelight of Isadora Renfield's collection. He described a woman who went missing the previous spring, perfectly recalling the distinctive, hand-stitched pattern of her blue woolen shawl, a shawl he had later seen Celestine Harowe packaging for transport to a merchant in another county. These were not the inventions of a frightened child. They were the crystalline observations of a witness. Each detail aligned with the missing persons report, weaving a thread through disparate, cold cases that stretched back over 5 years. Sheriff Aldrich felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a feeling far colder than the winter night outside. He had spent years dismissing the persistent, unsettling rumors about the Hollow as nothing more than local gossip. Now, he was forced to confront the terrifying possibility that the superstitions were, in fact, a pale shadow of a monstrous reality. This was not fantasy. This was a map, delivered by a terrified child, leading directly into the heart of an unimaginable darkness. Samuel's testimony, recorded in careful, sometimes trembling, shorthand by Deputy Marshal William Hayes over the next several days, became the blueprint for understanding the Hollow's monstrous secret. The boy spoke of what the families called the arrangement, a term uttered with the chilling normalcy of a business venture or a farming cooperative. He laid bare a sophisticated system of organized crime that defied all known precedents in rural America. His words painted a picture of a community that was not just a collection of families, but a single predatory organism, with each member functioning as a vital part of the whole. From Marshal Hayes's meticulous, increasingly disturbed notes, a terrifying operational structure emerged. Subject states his grandfather Erasmus maintained the books, Hayes wrote, detailed records of who came and went. Claims these books contain names, dates, and what he calls preparation notes. The psychological pressure on the small team of investigators escalated with every transcribed word. They were not merely hunting for a handful of killers. They were confronting an entire society, a culture built upon murder. Deputy Hayes would later recall feeling a profound sense of dislocation as he took the boy's statement, as if the known world were dissolving around him. Samuel's account revealed the chilling psychological bedrock of the arrangement, the systematic indoctrination of its own children. He described family gatherings, held under the guise of seasonal festivals, where the adults discussed logistics with the same casual tone others might use to plan harvest schedules. Which routes saw the most traffic? Which seasons brought the most vulnerable, isolated travelers? How to properly dispose of belongings without attracting attention. These were the lessons taught around the hearth, the dark catechism of the hollow. The children were fed a steady diet of folklore. Ancient tales of the mountains respun into cautionary parables about the dangers and inherent untrustworthiness of outsiders. They learned through observation, through a gradual, horrifying normalization that hollowed out their empathy. They were told that their actions were a sacred duty necessary for survival. By adolescence, most had been so thoroughly conditioned that they viewed their practices as not only normal, but righteous. The horror for the investigators was no longer just the discovery of bones, but the realization that they were facing an enemy whose moral compass pointed toward a darkness so absolute that true north had become impossible to find. They were facing generations of people who genuinely could not comprehend that their way of life was a crime. The true turning point, the moment that transformed the investigation from a criminal inquiry into an archaeological dig into the very soul of evil, came on February 20th, 1907, acting on the increasingly detailed memories provided by Samuel. Sheriff Aldrich's team returned to the Fenwick cabin. Samuel had spoken of a hiding place, a secret known only to the family chronicler, a place he had stumbled upon by accident years before, following the boys' precise instructions. They removed a specific sequence of floorboards in Erasmus's study, beneath the rough-hewn planks. They found a carefully constructed lead-lined cavity, packed inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the relentless mountain damp, lay 17 leather-bound volumes. The creak of their bindings as they were opened was the first sound the arrangement's secrets had made in the outside world. They were Erasmus Fenwick's journals. The impact of the discovery was immediate and cataclysmic. These were not mere diaries. They were operational manuals, psychological studies, and a complete 64-year history of a criminal enterprise. The brittle, yellowed pages felt heavy in the investigators' hands, weighted with the ink of countless lives. The earliest entries, dating to 1843, confirmed the genesis of the evil. They detailed the starvation, the grief of Celestine Heroe, and the slow, agonizing decision to turn from victims of nature into predators of men. The journals documented, with a disturbing clinical detachment, the psychological transformation of an entire community. Erasmus noted how each family member's initial resistance was eroded through gradual exposure, shared guilt, and the undeniable profits of their new trade. The books were filled with chillingly practical observations, such as an entry from 1899. Young Sibyl shows promise in reading travelers' intentions. Her mother, Cornelia, fears the gift will make the girl too valuable to lose to marriage outside the hollow. But the most earth-shattering revelation lay buried in the final entries of the most recent volume. It explained the true catalyst for Samuel's desperate 40-mile flight through the snow. The boy hadn't simply overheard a conversation that shocked his emerging conscience. On the night of January 10th, while hiding in the Treadwell root cellar during a family meeting, he had watched through the gaps in the floorboards as Ignatius Treadwell and Hortense Blackmore discussed the fate of 3 travelers. Their casual discussion of torture and murder was horrifying enough, but it was what followed that broke through years of careful conditioning. They began to speak of the need for a new initiation, a teaching moment for the youngest generation to bind them permanently to the family through shared guilt. They needed a subject who was known to them, one whose resistance would serve as a powerful lesson in loyalty. They spoke of a boy who was growing old enough to question, a boy who was becoming a liability. They spoke his name. They spoke of Samuel. In that moment of profound, paralyzing terror, Samuel Fenwick realized that the arrangement was turning on itself. The investigators, reading these words by lantern light, shared a look of cold, stark horror. The boy in their care hadn't just fled a house of monsters. He had escaped his own execution. He was not just a witness to the family's monstrosity. He had been chosen as its next sacrifice. The machine, in its insatiable hunger and paranoia, had begun to consume its own parts. With the journals of Erasmus Fenwick as their guide, the investigators moved through Whispering Hollow with a newfound terrifying purpose. The vague superstitions and disconnected reports that had once defined the case were now replaced by the cold, hard text of a 60-year confession. The words on the page were a map, and every location Samuel had mentioned, every name Erasmus had inscribed, now became a point of grim pilgrimage for Sheriff Aldridge and his men. The myths of the Hollow were about to be exhumed and exposed under the harsh light of day. And the reality was infinitely more horrifying than any folklore could have conceived. Their first focus was the network of root cellars that Samuel had described. From the outside, they appeared to be nothing more than ordinary storage pits, common to any mountain homestead. But upon closer inspection, guided by the schematics found tucked between the pages of a journal entry from 1860, their true nature was revealed. The walls were unusually thick, reinforced with stone and packed with insulating moss and sawdust. Dr. Farweather's team noted that this construction was not for preserving produce from frost, but for muffling sound. Deep grooves had been carved into the earthen floors, leading to discreet drainage pits, a chillingly pragmatic solution for dealing with blood and other fluids. And most damningly, investigators discovered that several of the cellars, belonging to different families, were connected by a series of narrow, hand-dug tunnels. It was a subterranean network, a hidden circulatory system for the arrangement's dark business, allowing for the discreet movement of victims between properties without ever breaking the surface of their placid, pastoral facade. Forensic reports from the time would later confirm that the soil composition within these cellars contained organic residues inconsistent with agricultural use, but wholly consistent with human decomposition over a prolonged period. The tools discovered buried beneath the foundations of the Whitford cabin were not the simple implements of farmers or blacksmiths. They had been modified with a chilling ingenuity, their forms twisted to serve a singular, monstrous purpose. There were hooks, saws, and restraints, all showing evidence of specialized use and repeated sharpening, their metal edges bearing microscopic traces that told a story of unspeakable violence. Each item was a testament to the methodical, businesslike efficiency of the family's operations. But perhaps the most irrefutable evidence came from Isadora Renfield's family collection, no longer just a room of curiosities. It was now understood to be a macabre museum. Investigators, stepping into the dusty, airless room, were met with the faint, cloying smell of decay and forgotten lives. On crude wooden shelves sat a chillingly ordered display of trophies. Using the detailed descriptions from Erasmus's journals, they were able to match specific items to individuals who had vanished. A silver locket, tarnished with age, belonged to a young woman who had disappeared on her way to her wedding in 1888. A custom-made rifle with an inlaid stock was traced back to a wealthy land surveyor from Pennsylvania who had vanished in 1895. The physical evidence was overwhelming, a silent chorus of objects crying out in accusation. The journals had provided the narrative. These artifacts provided the undeniable, material proof. The hollow's guilt was no longer a matter of testimony. It was a matter of tangible, verifiable fact. News traveled slowly in the mountains, but the sight of a combined force of 18 men from 3 counties, led by Sheriff Aldrich, descending into the hollow was a message that needed no telegraph. The arrangement's leaders, masters of observation and survival, knew their carefully constructed world was collapsing. The 60-year reign of secrecy was over, but they would not face justice. The families, bound by a covenant of shared guilt, had one final protocol to enact a scorched earth policy designed to take their secrets and their world to the grave. Their final act was not one of surrender, but of ultimate defiance. Their confession would be written in fire and blood. As the posse approached through the grey morning fog on February 24th, 1907, they were met not with the crack of rifle fire, but with an apocalyptic vision. Smoke, thick and black, billowed into the winter sky from 3 separate points in the valley. The sound of crackling timber echoed strangely in the hollow, a final, roaring whisper. They had expected to find families barricaded, ready for a siege. Instead, they discovered a community in the final, convulsive stages of self-destruction. The Renfield cabin burned brightest, a funeral pyre visible for miles. Inside, the charred remains. Investigators found evidence that Isadora had spent her final hours not packing to flee, but methodically destroying her life's work. She had been feeding her collection of trophies into the flames. A high priestess making a final, desperate sacrifice to the gods of secrecy. The other family heads had embraced their own forms of annihilation with the same methodical precision they had applied to their crimes. Barnabas Whitford's body was discovered at the bottom of his own well, the very source of water he had used to lure so many to their doom. His ankles were bound with heavy chains, and the arrangement's most specialized tools were chained to his waist, pulling him down into the dark, mercury-laced water. It was a grotesque, self-inflicted baptism, a final act of dark ownership over the domain he had controlled for so long. Ignatius Treadwell had constructed an elaborate death trap in his cabin, a mechanism triggered by the front door that would have released a cascade of sharpened stakes from the ceiling while igniting barrels of lamp oil. It was a final, hateful act of malice designed to kill those who sought justice. And Hortense Blackmore, in an act of supreme legal cunning, had consumed a carefully measured dose of plant-based toxins that didn't kill her, but induced permanent neurological damage, effectively destroying her own memory and rendering herself incompetent to stand trial. She had chosen a living death to escape the consequences of her life. But the most chilling scene awaited them at Celestine Heroe's trading post. She had barricaded herself inside, not alone, but with 17 captives' family members, including children and new brides, who had attempted to surrender rather than participate in the final destruction. Forensic evidence suggests she systematically executed every one of them. A final, horrific enforcement of the family's code of silence. Their bodies were found arranged in a semicircle, positioned as if they had been forced to watch each other die. Celestine's body was in the center, a single gunshot wound to her head. The ledger of a final, bloody transaction closed forever. It was the ultimate perversion of her role as matriarch, a mother putting her entire family to a final, violent sleep. The last act of the arrangement was not murder for profit, but murder for silence, even in death. Their commitment to the secret was absolute. In the cold, ash-covered dawn that followed the fires. The full scope of the legal and societal challenge facing the authorities became devastatingly clear. With the architects of the arrangement having passed their own brutal judgment, the state was left with a crime scene of unprecedented scale and complexity, but few living perpetrators to prosecute. The public reaction in the surrounding counties was a mixture of horror, vindication for decades of dismissed rumors, and a profound, chilling fear. How do you bring justice to ghosts? How do you charge individuals for crimes committed across multiple generations, when most of the defendants had been children when their participation began? The legal jurisprudence of the time was utterly unprepared for a criminal conspiracy so deeply embedded in the fabric of a community that it functioned as a culture in its own right. The central dilemma was the profound blurring of lines between victim and perpetrator. The surviving children and younger adults, now in state custody, were a heartbreaking and terrifying puzzle. They were psychologically damaged, suffering from severe trauma responses, and, as medical examinations would reveal, the long-term effects of mercury poisoning from contaminated well water. They had participated in monstrous acts, yet they had been systematically stripped of the moral framework necessary to comprehend their own crimes. In their own minds, they were not criminals. They were loyal sons and daughters, protecting their way of life from a hostile world. This raised fundamental questions that the courts had never before considered. Where does culpability begin when indoctrination starts at birth? Can a person be held fully accountable for actions they were taught to believe were righteous? The case of Whispering Hollow would force a radical re-evaluation of legal concepts of conspiracy, duress, and diminished capacity. Prosecutors realized they could not simply apply existing laws. They would have to innovate, creating new legal arguments to encompass a form of evil so patient and so deeply ingrained. The trials that followed were a landmark in American legal history, establishing precedents that would influence the prosecution of organized, family-based criminal enterprises, cults, and multi-generational conspiracies for decades to come. The Hollow's legacy, it turned out, was not just a pile of bones discovered in its soil, but the difficult questions it carved into the very foundation of American criminal justice. It was a stark reminder that the law, like the men who enforce it, can sometimes be confronted with a darkness that it is ill-equipped to understand, let alone prosecute. The search for justice for the arrangement's countless victims was only just beginning, and its path would be as twisted and murky as the Hollow itself. The legal precedents established by the Whispering Hollow case were a cold comfort to a public grappling with the sheer scale of the atrocity. The trials of the few surviving. Younger family members were fraught with complexity, but they were a sideshow. The true architects of the arrangement were dead, their motives and the full extent of their operations seemingly burned to ash with their cabins. The investigation had reached a dead end. A story concluded with a violent, self-inflicted final chapter, that is, until the state turned its full attention to the one person who had chosen survival over loyalty. The one cog that had deliberately broken from the machine, Sybil Harcourt, aged 28, sat in a Randolph County jail cell, a living Rosetta Stone to a language of evil that no one else could speak. District Attorney Harrison Webb, a man whose career had been defined by methodical prosecution, initially saw Sybil as a star witness, a traumatized victim who could help him close the book on the Hollow. He was unprepared for what he was about to uncover. Over 4 days of intensive interviews, conducted in a small, airless room that smelled of lye soap and human fear, Sybil Harcourt did not just provide details. She completely redefined the entire case, what investigators had discovered in the Hollow. She explained with hands that would not stop shaking, represented only the arrangement's final, degraded phase, a period when advancing age, internal conflicts, and decades of mercury poisoning had severely reduced the family's operational efficiency, the true scope of their enterprise. During its peak years in the 1870s and 80s was something far more ambitious and far more terrifying. Sibyl revealed that murder was only a byproduct of their primary business, the acquisition and exploitation of human resources. She described what she called breeding protocols, a chillingly pragmatic system where suitable outsiders with valuable skills, doctors, engineers, craftsmen, were occasionally incorporated into the families through forced marriages. These individuals were not merely prisoners, they were assets to be assimilated. Their compliance was ensured through the constant threat of violence, combined with a systematic psychological conditioning that stripped them of their former identity, slowly turning them into compliant, hollowed-out members of the clan. Their children, born into this world, received a specialized education. Young girls learned psychological manipulation techniques disguised as hospitality training. Boys studied anatomy, construction, and tool modification through what Sibyl would only describe as hands-on practice with living subjects. Furthermore, she exposed the arrangement's most shocking secret, its customer base. Her voice, barely a whisper, described a guest roster of individuals from respectable society. These were wealthy businessmen, prominent politicians, and community leaders from across 4 states. According to Sibyl, they were men who paid premium rates for the privilege of participating in the arrangement's activities. They were bored with the mundanity of their lives, seeking a transgressive thrill that no other vice could offer. Whispering Hollow was their private hell, a place where they could indulge their darkest appetites, protected by the family's absolute discretion and geographic isolation. This revelation was horrifying. Whispering Hollow was not just a predator's den. It was a destination for depravity, a service industry catering to the evil that lurked behind the public facades of the elite. The final, devastating revelation from Sibyl concerned the arrangement's future. The Hollow was never meant to be the final word. It was merely the prototype, the proof of concept. She produced, from memory, detailed maps and operational protocols for an expansion. The families had been preparing to establish 12 similar arrangements in remote, economically depressed areas across Appalachia, creating a network of interconnected criminal enterprises. The Hollow was just the beginning. Her information led to the arrest of 17 individuals in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, preventing the establishment of a regional empire of murder that could have claimed hundreds of additional victims. But her cooperation came at a cost. Sibyl Harcourt, the woman who had brought down a 60-year dynasty of evil, was herself a creation of that evil, a permanently damaged soul who had traded one prison for another, forever haunted by the knowledge of what human beings are capable of. Federal investigators officially closed the Whispering Hollow case files in 1924, declaring the arrangement's network fully dismantled. Sibyl Harcourt, granted clemency for her testimony, was given a new identity and relocated to a quiet farmhouse in rural Kentucky under a nascent federal witness protection program. For decades, the story seemed to have a definitive, if tragic, end. The evil had been identified, contained, and extinguished. But ideas, unlike people, do not die so easily, and the most virulent ideas are often the most patient. On October 13th, 1963, Sibyl Harcourt died alone in that farmhouse. Her final words, whispered to a visiting nurse, were a warning about something she claimed was still out there, still hungry. Her death was ruled to be from natural causes, but what was discovered in her home suggested a legacy that was anything but natural. Hidden in a sealed compartment beneath her cellar floor, investigators found a collection of documents that shattered the official narrative. There were maps, detailed genealogical charts, and location surveys far more extensive than what she had provided in 1907. Correspondence, written in a complex code that used the unique insular dialect of the Hollow, took cryptographers months to decipher. The letters reveal a horrifying truth: Sybil had never truly left the arrangement. Her cooperation with authorities had been a calculated deception, aided by the primitive nature of early 20th century witness protection and her own profound genius for manipulation. She had played the role of the perfect, broken survivor. In reality, she was the arrangement's new queen for 55 years. She had functioned not as a reformed witness, but as a double agent, an intelligence coordinator for a new generation of criminal enterprises. From the case notes of Dr. Harold Blackwood, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated her final letters. Subject was a master strategist. Her cooperation was a calculated sacrifice, feeding the government the dying heart of her organization while she quietly cultivated its new, more resilient offshoots. The documents revealed that the arrangement's core principles had been adapted and exported. The new network operated not with axes and knives, but with contracts, legal loopholes, and psychological coercion. The methodology was the same: identify a vulnerable target, isolate them, exploit their resources, and dispose of the consequences. But the tools were now those of the modern world. The letters referenced active operations, not in isolated mountain communities, but within legitimate institutions, banks, hospitals, government agencies, and even religious organizations had been infiltrated by individuals trained in the arrangement's methodology of psychological manipulation and exploitation. The family's original crimes represented only the visible surface of a criminal enterprise that had learned to wear a respectable face. The evil had not died. It had simply evolved, metastasizing from a localized cancer into a systemic, invisible infection. The true legacy of Whispering Hollow, then, is not the 17 skeletons unearthed in 1907, but the enduring, adaptable nature of the evil they represented. The arrangement never truly died. It simply learned to wear different faces, to speak in a different voice, and to operate within the very communities that believed themselves to be safe. It traded its crude tools for balance sheets, its root cellars for boardrooms, and its mountain isolation for the anonymity of modern bureaucracy. The fundamental hunger, the calculated exploitation of the vulnerable for profit and power, remained the same. This evolution highlights a deeply unsettling truth: the raw, physical evil of the Hollow, for all its horror, is somehow less terrifying than the clean, administrative evil that followed. It is one thing to fear the monster in the woods. It is another to realize the monster may be your banker, your doctor, or the administrator of your nursing home. This brings us to a final, chilling question that extends far beyond the foggy ridges of Appalachia. When we peel back the veneer of civilization, how certain are we of what lies beneath? The families of Whispering Hollow were an anomaly only in their methods, not in their motivations. Their story serves as a terrifying parable, a warning that the most monstrous acts are often born from the most familiar human desires for security, for prosperity, for control. How many institutions that we trust with our most vulnerable citizens have been compromised by individuals trained to view exploitation as professional duty rather than criminal activity? The answer remains buried in classified archives and unsolved cases. But near Sybil's old Kentucky farmhouse, local residents still report strange occurrences: the sound of digging late at night, and the persistent smell of wood smoke, even when no fires burn for miles. Some say you can still hear voices on the wind, speaking in a language of a time long past. The arrangement is gone, but the hunger, it seems, remains.